Okay. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I will give a brief introduction for our speaker, Talia. Talia is currently a postdoc at the Joint Math and Science Education Program at UC San Diego State. She's currently finishing up her dissertation and is planning on continuing with the research in graduate math education. With that being said, I'm giving you the floor, Talia.
Thank you, Anna. And just so everybody knows, I'm a doc candidate, not a postdoc yet. Okay, cool. So I'm going to share with you a little bit, like a very small slice of some of my dissertation work today. And I will share my screen. It's been a while since I did this online, so sorry. Hang with me one second. Okay. What type of screen is everyone seeing? Just the slides, not the speaker notes or anything?
Yeah, it looks like just the slides.
Okay, that's all I see too, so that we'll make it work. Okay. So my dissertation is titled Exploring Women's Identities in Doctoral Mathematics. And it's very much motivated by my own experiences as a first generation college student. Oh, forgot to mention I have a little cold. So if I sound funny, that's what's going on. A first generation college student and Mexican American woman in mathematics. I've had a strong sense of being an outsider to the field, being tokenized, just sort of feeling like unnatural in that setting. And this has really driven my desire to improve mathematics education for students who don't fit the norm. So today I'm going to go over introduction and motivation, literature and theory, methods and preliminary results, and actually going to skip the research trajectory part. So some motivation. In K-12 mathematics, traditional measures of success have largely become more equal among like boys and girls. Underrepresentation in, or sorry, excuse me, undergraduate representation has also improved due to efforts of like active learning. But as you keep moving through post-secondary education, representation starts to decrease quite a bit. So as we look at doctoral mathematics, women earn 28% of doctoral degrees in math, which is a decrease from a high of 32% in 2014. And after we leave graduate school, women occupy 24% of tenure-track positions, and only 15% of full professors in mathematics are women. So obviously an underrepresentation problem. But beyond representation, sort of the quality of women's experiences are affected by this lack of representation. So some even claim that underrepresentation is one of the factors that makes math spaces oppressive for women. And so some of the ways that underrepresentation sort of manifest is that women may feel compelled to minimize their gender expression. They report negative advising experiences and a lack of belonging. Before I continue on, I want to take a slight detour talking about deficit discourses in research. So discourses, I take the understanding of them to be a social, cultural, and historical construction of perspective. And the reason I bring this up is that research may reinforce deficit discourses of underrepresented groups, and that these discourses have the potential to impact women's experiences. So I want to be careful in my research not to continually position women as sort of fatalistic characters in mathematics. So as such, my research goals include highlighting women's experiences and ways of participating as valid and worth knowing, but also it's really important to me to attend to women's agency while acknowledging contextual constraints. So not just looking at them as victims of circumstance, but also as agentic characters in these contexts. Overall, my dissertation study sort of focuses on 3 areas. And I just share this because it helps situate the rest of this talk a little bit. The first is to characterize the mathematical identities of women in advanced mathematics. But all of my participants are also members of their local AWM. So one of my research questions is about characterizing the social activity of a graduate chapter in of the Association for Women in Math. And then the third research question looks at understanding any possible relationship between the women's mathematical identities and their participation in that AWM chapter. But like I said, we're just going to focus on this first question here. So a little bit of background and theory. So early research about women in doctoral mathematics has focused on integration and persistence. And what was found is that program structure is a factor in persistence, meaning that things like qualifying exams and coursework created obstacles to women like persisting in doctoral mathematics. But also, these program structures were upheld by faculty beliefs about teaching and learning. So faculty reported believing in a sort of innate ability in mathematics. And so to them, things like difficult qualifying exams make sense because if you have just the natural ability to do math, then the quals will not be a problem. And then women also reported difficult or no relationships with faculty as an obstacle to integrating. A little bit later, by the same author, Herzig, switched her theoretical framing from integration and persistence to include sense of belonging, which she defines as a sense that one is an important and active participant in both academic and social communities. So some factors that contributed to women's sense of belonging were either seeking out role models, so women that they could look up to who were successful, or also being role models themselves. Fitting in, this is referring to the a representation as well. So they had a hard time fitting in spaces dominated by men. And then also feeling left out in the fact that they wanted a work-life balance when they felt like everyone else was sort of singularly focused on mathematics. But this really only tells part of the picture. It doesn't do much to connect to broader systems of power. And so more recently, we see work that has taken an Afrarian approach. And so this research found that women's stories of success are often also accompanied by narratives of struggle, that they had felt as outsiders because there was a boys' club, a sense of camaraderie among the men that they didn't have access to, and also that they might need to develop a thick skin in response to being in a competitive environment. And sort of my critique in some areas where I hope to extend integration and sense of belonging, an underlying assumption there is that women must move toward an existing static culture. It positions women as outsiders with deficits in their ability to integrate. And then the social and structural contexts are not linked to broader systems of power. The Freirean approach does a better job of connecting to broader systems of power by assuming gender is an oppressive force in advanced mathematics. It also complicates success by addressing the cost of this success. However, it de-emphasizes women as vital agentic members of their local context. One area of research that I think does a good job of connecting context to women's choices is focus on identity. So we see this in undergraduate mathematics, where women respond to being in a masculinized space by explaining their mathematical ability as abnormal or special. They might also downplay their abilities as a result of hard work rather than innate ability. They might minimize their gender expression by becoming invisible, or they might have a hybridized response. So they retain a strong, visible femininity alongside their mathematics. And so my research question for today is, how do women in doctoral mathematics describe being a woman in math? The frameworks I leverage include figured worlds, with a little bit of refinement to focus in further on identity, gender, and discourse. So figured worlds are defined as a socially and culturally constructed realm of interpretation in which particular characters and actors are recognized. Significance is assigned to certain acts, and particular outcomes are valued over others. So I like to think of this as, how might you act with your family during the holidays versus how might you act as a concert? What sort of things are valued? What behaviors are normal in those different contexts? And so we can sort of translate this to, how do people construct themselves in the context of advanced mathematics? So Holland et al. Define identity as people tell others who they are, but even more important, they tell themselves and then try to act as though they are who they say they are. These self-understandings, especially those with strong emotional resonance for the teller, are what we refer to as identities. Okay, so some things that I draw on more heavily, I call figured world sort of everything but the kitchen sink theory, because it's a sociocultural theory. It draws a lot on Vygotsky, Bakhtin. I'll go into that. Also talks about a lot about discourses. But what I use here, first, Bakhtin and self-authoring. So first is dialogism, which says that individuals are in a continuous state of being addressed in answering. So within a figured world, you're being addressed by the context and responding to that context. And then heteroglossia, which says that individuals may hold multiple stories about themselves at, oh, there's a little typo there, at one time. So you can think of sort of the devil and the angel on one on each shoulder, and sort of making a choice about how to respond. For Vygotsky, it's a pretty classic reliance on mediation. However, Holland and colleagues also include discourses as part of the cultural tools that people use to mediate their identity development. So identity construction through self-authoring is mediated by these cultural artifacts. And in particular, I focus on discourses as these cultural artifacts that women use to construct their mathematical identities. And I do that because there's some evidence that it's important. So again, discourses are a social, cultural, and historical construction of perspective. Some discourses that have been identified previously are that mathematical ability is innate, colorblind, and gender neutral. These create dichotomies that position femininity and masculinity in opposition and associate mathematics with masculinity. And these aren't just like ephemeral ideas out there in broader societal discourse. They also create inequitable experiences for Black, Latinx, women, and gender nonconforming individuals. So they're pretty important. A little bit more about identity. I think it can sort of be analytically a little bit vague. So I just want to add a couple more points that it's developed through participation. It's the stories we tell about ourselves and others and the behaviors influenced by these stories. And then it supports a critical understanding of the relationship between context and individuals. So it does a really good job of one of my research goals, which is to support understanding women's agency while also understanding the contextual constraints. And then as far as gender, this is also socially constructed. It's a performance and it's enforced through cultural and institutional practices. Despite gender being a performance and thus there being many, many variations, there is a societal commitment to a gender binary. And doing mathematics includes performing masculinity. So this complicates experiences for women in mathematics. And lastly, gender hierarchies place women at the bottom in mathematics. So although gender is, something that could be varied and fluid, there are these societal commitments to a gender binary, and it creates a gendered hierarchy in mathematics specifically. Okay, so that was a lot of theory. Here's a little visual to sort of think about how I'm understanding things. So there's the figured world of doctoral mathematics. We see that discourses about math and gender sort of bridge between broader societal power structures and the figured world of doctoral mathematics. In addition to that, we have other actors, the activity of that figure world, and other artifacts. And then there's the women's mathematical identities. So their mathematical identities are mediated through these other constructs, and then through self-authoring, they tell themselves who they are and sort of respond to the figure world about who they are. Okay. Methods. Okay. Go over the context, participants, and data corpus, and then preliminary analysis. So Southwest University, where I pulled my participants from, is a large public high research activity institution. In 2022, the mathematics department had 180 students enrolled in the PhD program, about 60 faculty, including 7 women. The program structure was pretty typical: 2 years of coursework, 3 qualifying exams, after which you would choose an advisor, propose an advanced candidacy, and then defend your dissertation. So I chose my participants in a stratified, purposeful sampling, sort of after a convenient sampling, with respect to years experience in the program. So there were 2 that were still in coursework, 1 in early research, 1 in advanced research, and 1 taking a leave of absence. Sort of within this, I also tried to get as much variation in sort of ethnic, racial, national backgrounds. So 2 of my participants were also international students of South Asian descent. This is all of the data for my dissertation, but for this, I just analyzed the first round of interviews and the focus group. And so what ended up happening is I had a bit of an interesting, I guess, response from a lot of the women. I asked them questions about being a woman in math, what it meant to them, and I was surprised to find a little bit of resistance, and so I realized that this label, woman in math, held more meaning for the women beyond just their own personal experiences. So like I say here, it invoked a lot of responses, some proud, some distancing, which revealed to me a larger cultural meaning associated with the label woman in math. And so I actually take this up as a discourse that mediates the women's mathematical identities. Um, I think I already said this. How do women in doctoral mathematics experience being a woman in math? It's a research question. And so the analysis includes just a few of the interview questions. So from interview one, what does it mean to be a woman in mathematics, and how has being a woman shaped your experience in mathematics? And so early on in interview one, when I asked those two questions, is when I got those sort of surprising responses. And so I decided to also ask the question again during the focus group interview, which is the last data collection. And then, sorry, just those questions, because it was a preliminary report that I wrote this for, were transcribed and open coded for distinct themes. So very preliminary results here. And so some themes that emerged were the ideas of anticipating doubt, proving yourself, and transcending gender. So anticipating doubt included the idea that, let me see, 4 out of the 5 women reported the same theme. So they talked about expecting others to question their mathematical ability. So Maya, year 1, said, I also think that a lot of people do not expect women to be good at math, even in grad school, in study groups, not maybe taking women seriously or kind of ignoring what they're saying because there is a kind of implicit assumption that it's not going to be useful or correct. So this was pretty common. A lot of women described expecting others to question their mathematical ability. And sort of as a response to this, women also talked about proving themselves. So again, 4 out of 5, the participants reported statements related to this theme. It wasn't the same 4 out of 5 as the previous, but still 4 out of 5. So Cindy, a year 2, said, I felt like to get someone's respect, you had to usually show you were smart enough. Maybe you're working on a problem set and you figure something out, and then maybe people will then start listening to you and including you. I think this is interesting too, because in addition to saying she needed to prove herself, Cindy's also talking about a benefit that she might gain from proving herself. People will start listening to her. She'll have more access to being included in groups. And then lastly, we have Ida. She was the only person who had excerpts related to this theme. So the first one says, I have a lot of good at math privilege, even though I don't have male privilege. My advisor is very impressive, and it seems that the results that I have done in my PhD are very impressive. So it seems that the weight of her famousness in the field and her good reputation far outweighs any sort of women in math stuff. And so this is sort of the first time I had seen her talk about the idea that you might be able to escape being a woman in math is sort of how it sounds to me. And later on, she sort of connects the two, proving yourself and transcending gender. So the first excerpt reads, I always felt I had to be unequivocally better than all of the men in order to be taken seriously. I always had to have perfect scores, have the best grade in class, have everything super, super correct, because I always felt like if I missed 5 points on the exam, if I was a 95 instead of 100, then that would be the reason that someone could write me off. And then later she says, but I have experienced the sense that if you are good enough, that can transcend the gender stuff. So this is super interesting to me. She's talking about having to be perfect, and it seems very motivating to her to be perfect because then she can sort of experience mathematics without maybe being a woman. And so I'm seeing this as sort of, I guess, a process maybe. So a woman might anticipate doubt from those around her and respond by proving herself. And then with Ida, she was the only one who sort of had this reward at the end, that if you prove yourself well enough, you can transcend the gender stuff. So just again, Ida was the only one who expressed transcending gender. And then it's interesting that in other parts of the interview, she characterized herself as very feminine. And she was also the only person who was super, super consistent in her good at math privilege. It's like through her whole math life story, she was described herself as sort of exceptional at math. And so while Ida describes it as transcending gender stuff, I see it a bit differently. So according to Hottinger, it's challenging for women to identify as both a woman and a mathematician at the same time. So discursively, this is something that is very challenging for women. But Ida has found a way to be both woman and mathematician at the same time. So she expressed transcending gender, characterized herself as very feminine, and is consistent in her good at math privilege. And this allowed her to be both a woman and a mathematician. So instead of sort of escaping her gender, she's able to sort of lean into her gender more. And I think that's pretty interesting. And that's the end. And so I have time for questions. And then I also have questions from the reviewers from Room. And so if we have time, I want y'all to help me answer those too. Should I stop sharing?
Thank you so much for your talk. I think it was really fascinating. I have a quick question. I think in the literature review, or the theory background, I think one of the key points mentioned that being um, doing mathematics somehow implied being masculine. Um, and I just, unless I read it or interpreted it incorrectly, I just don't really understand what that means.
Yeah, so Heather Mendick wrote this really like seminal book about masculinities in mathematics and did some extensive research about um, how gender is expressed in mathematics. And so there was a lot of dichotomies that she identified. And the ones that were associated with like a strong or good math identity were also associated with masculinity. So the big like result of that book that has been really impactful for the field is that doing mathematics means performing masculinity. So it all kind of ties together as far as like performing your gender identity and then performing your math identity. And so, yes, that is what I mean when I describe doing math means doing masculinity. So things like being competitive or even the idea of being really good at math versus just good at math, these are things that are associated with masculinity and with associated with doing mathematics well.
Sorry, a follow-up question to that. Does
Mm-hmm.
that mean a perception uh, that is had from the outside people when they look at mathematicians and they sort of imply for themselves this masculinity, or is it something that mathematicians experience themselves as well?
So identity is shaped socially. So there needs to be some recognition from other people that you are this person. So I can say myself like, let's say I say, I'm trying to think of an example that's appropriate to the context. Um, So there are a lot of women who are brilliant at math, right? And yet, at the same time, all of these women express being doubted at math. And that's because they are not recognized as good at math by the social context. So your identity requires some recognition by people outside of you. And so it's kind of both. It's a reflexive thing. It's like I I perform these aspects of my identity, but they also need to be recognized by the people in that context in order for it to be reified or legitimized.
Thank you.
One that I think about a lot on that line, in addition to some of the ones that you mentioned, Talia, that will lead into the question that I'm hoping to ask. Before I say that, though, thanks for the talk. I'm really appreciating learning about your work, and I'm glad that you're doing this work. It was interesting to see some of those quotes and start digging into how some students are thinking about this in doctoral ed. One of the ways that I think about the doing masculinity bit is specifically around emotions and how we usually in mathematics and STEM in general think that those need to be completely removed, whereas emotionality and leaning into your emotions and channeling those is often seen as a historically and culturally feminine trait. And removing a lot of that has led to a lot of, I think, very negative things in doctoral programs. I'm sure, Talia, you have a lot more to say based on what your students shared with you and, I mean, our own experiences, honestly, in these spaces. But to narrow it into a question that I was wondering, I know you're in the preliminary phases, so you might not have thought about this yet, but what I was really interested in is the phrasing of transcend. I know you mentioned that too. Initially, I was unsure exactly how the student was seeing it from that quote. Was their name Ida?
Yeah.
Ida. Okay, good. I wasn't sure how Ida was seeing it based on the quote. It was making me think like, is transcend removing yourself from your gender? But then later you talked about how she really was leaning into her gender and building on the Hottinger saying she was leaning into her gender and her identity as a mathematician. I'm curious, did you feel like, what's the best way of wording this question? I guess transcend for me has the implication of moving beyond and even also the trajectory as a way of how you've been like at least preliminarily organizing these things. The one thing I wonder about, and you spoke to this as well, about the issue of not just considering integration and inclusion, but thinking about how women can be in this space how they are and not have to just integrate, but we're also considering other factors and creating a space where everybody can thrive in ways that are natural to their ways of being. But the linearity and the transcending and the forward arc, it's all making me wonder about, I guess, the ways that other women were talking about this in the interviews that you did. Were they, and I know you said it was very varied, it's not going to be one size fits all, but I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about that word and the complexities of transcending or leaning into like the intersection. I guess, does that make sense? That's not a fully formed question, but a lot of your imagery and words of the students are just making me think on this.
Yeah, no, I think I can explain it a little bit better with there's a good comparison. So sort of like developed some archetypes since this, and Ida is her archetype is the woman mathematician, and there's another woman who her archetype is the mathematician, comma only, and she is very, very direct about the fact that she wants to be identified only as a mathematician and not as a woman, and she's committed to that like partitioning. And I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that Ida has all of this success and identifies really strongly with being really good at math, or, you know, always, I guess, sort of like she even talks at one point about having a brilliant mathematical mind. So she subscribes to these discourses that are typically associated with men. So specifically with Mendick, the really good at math versus good at math is associated with men. And I think her leaning into that specific masculinity has allowed her to be able to sort of perform her gender identity fully. Whereas the other woman, Miriam, doesn't have a strong like association with that really good at math or that consistent success, sort of like this less privilege, I guess. And so it's very committed to not being associated as a woman in math, just a mathematician. And there's other ways too. There's another woman who her archetype is like the teacher, and she's very reticent to acknowledge the role of gender in her experiences. And I think that is in part because she's had like, I hate to say use the word success so much, but she has to take a leave of absence, and she's choosing to leave the program, and she's had sort of like these negative experiences, and is really, really reticent to assign gender to any of those experiences. And so I do think there's a relationship between Ida's like confidence and strong identity with really good at math and her ability to fully be a woman in math. And so even though she says transcending gender, I kind of see it not as leaving gender behind, but being able to really like be a woman in math at the same time as being a mathematician, whereas the other participants didn't express anything like that.
It almost feels like, correct me if I'm not hearing you right, but almost like transcending in the sense of being willing to live and perform both kind of genders in ways that resonate with you. Like we're all masculine and feminine in different ways, right? Like we all can be competitive, even though that's historically been associated with masculine, sometimes toxic masculinity. But we can all be emotional too, and leaning into. It sounds like transcending in the sense of not buying as much into the you need to be in one box. Almost is that kind of what she was getting at, and how you were thinking of it?
Yeah, I guess like transcending in the idea that you don't have to be like in a binary. And so she even talks about in another part of the interview that because there aren't very many women role models in math, she can create her own version of what that looks like. You know, there's like definitely a strong narrative of what a mathematician has been in the past, you know, like a old white guy with glasses. We all know the, you know, figure. But she says because there's not that many women in math and advanced math, she sort of has the choice to create herself however she wants, which is really cool. So yeah, and that didn't come up as much. Sort of like that's one of the binaries that Mendick identifies as the rational versus emotional. That didn't come up. Some stuff, other stuff that came up was sort of abstract versus like procedural. That came up a little bit, but mostly what came up for a lot of the women was sort of like things related to like innate ability and stuff like that. But I was mostly really surprised by their resistance to women in math. And just as a reminder, all of these women were participants in their local AWM. So I was like further surprised by that. And so, yeah, just trying to make sense of what that tension is there.
Thanks for such an in-depth answer.
Thanks, Anne. Sorry, excuse me. I'm just going to quickly look at. Thank you. Yeah, just some of the feedback from the room was just like kind of like so what type of stuff. So what are other scholars supposed to do with these themes? Um, what should the field do now? And so I don't really like know the answer to that right this second. It's something I should definitely think about. I feel like new information that the women would be resistant to these labels about women in math. Um, and so, yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but it seems like just from getting to know them, there's like a resistance to being sort of tokenized as a woman, which I can relate to myself. Um, and so it's hard to say, striking a balance between like support and tokenizing them. Like what does that look like? Or, culturally, what does that mean? Just not really sure at this point.
Sorry. I think if nothing else, with it being sort of an exploratory study, because it doesn't seem like there has been done much else, at least at the grad level. I think bringing the awareness to the field and just showing the results that, yes, we've heard of this, but this is concrete results from the field. Um, that already does a lot, I think. But I also think that just because I was in a similar boat with the study that I submitted for Room, where it hasn't really been done before. So I was just under the impression that the first step is to be aware, and see what an individual professor or a fellow grad student can do. Um, I don't know what that would be, but just a food for thought for anybody who reads this paper is, I think, inevitable.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
I'm actually really glad you brought that up because I feel like a lot of us, as we are interested in growing out an area where there isn't as much empirical work or even just work in general, beyond, of course, there's a lot of commentaries and people who have written blog posts. That's not invaluable, but it's different from research. And so I think a lot of us are probably going to get this a lot. It makes me think too, in line with your talk, I've been thinking about this a lot in how we think about theory and what it's supposed to do in the room community and research and what it does in the room community. And a lot of this varies based on what your paradigm of research is. I myself am finding that I lean into thinking through philosophy as a way to envision new possible worlds. And then, of course, I'm living that in my life. But I often get the question of, well, who cares if we're just thinking about this? And it's like, well, we have to think it first before it can be.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and this is the connection that I see to some of the things you're talking about with how we think about theory. And I think in the room community, it's very common. I wonder if some of that is because the room community is growing out of people who were originally professional mathematicians, and a lot of us are socialized in math departments. But I think one of the binaries that often comes up when we read about theory and math education research is living theory versus using theory. Like theory is a tool versus something that you live it with your life. Like I personally have really tried to embrace theories that I live in my teaching practice and my research practice, as opposed to just thinking of it as like a one-off theoretical framework that I write down to convince people that I was doing something in a certain way in my study. But this kind of reminds me of, again, masculine and feminine performances, kind of like you were talking. Masculine is like doing it. What's the answer right now? We have to know. whereas a lot of feminine care practices and also artistic practices are very everyday and lived. And I don't know, and I don't think that gives a concrete answer to how to navigate this problem, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot because I've been getting similar comments on some of my more exploratory work, especially in the room community, because I think that, again, the room community is growing out of this more masculine oriented approach to what counts as research and what is doing math ed. I don't know if that resonates with everybody else, but I do want to echo that I think it's a really good question that we should all probably think about together so that we can hopefully get more of our work accepted and keep growing the community together.
Yeah. Well, I feel a little bit stifled too because to me it's like a really big societal question. So, as part of this, I just like did a quick Google search like men in math, and then I did another one, women in math. And so if you Google women in math, it's like a lot of programs come up that like support women in math. And so there's like a really big messaging there about like women need help in math and women are really positioned as outside of math. And that's what Hodinger talks about. And so this sort of, I see my work as like identifying that women are like aware of this and have strategies for dealing with it. And so it's definitely a choice to sort of like minimize your being a woman to participate in this context versus someone who's like able to sort of lean into being a woman and I think it's just like a really interesting result. But as far as like what to do, I feel like, well, society has to change. Like
Talia, we haven't gotten a chance to meet yet. My name is Kristen. Sorry, my video is off. I'm a postdoc at USC, and I graduated from the University of Maryland Center for Math Ed. This question of so what, I think about that a lot as a more interdisciplinary researcher, but I think there are so many ways that you can really connect this so what question. Even though it does feel like this really broad question of like, well, society needs to change. Like as you were, your research is great, and I really enjoyed hearing about it. As you were sharing your work, I was sort of thinking about some of the work that's been done on like graduate students of color, and particularly like Black graduate students in math, and like Ebony McGee's work about like fronting and assimilation and how like I guess we're thinking about like the socialization piece of identity development, and this how is like the socialization piece influencing like whether other like social identities feel, I guess, like safe to fully embrace. And maybe some of the so what is that you're speaking to women who are in these graduate programs who are perhaps going to be like graduating from these programs. And I think there's sort of like two so what's of like one, it's problematizing that you have to divorce yourself from this social identity in order to progress to the graduate level, and like what are some of those implications for programs at the K-12 level or like undergraduate mathematics, if like this is sort of this pipeline issue of like, no, we probably shouldn't be telling like undergraduate students and K-12 students that you can't be your full authentic self in these spaces, but then we have this empirical research that you've done that says actually though there are women in these graduate programs that do feel like in order to be successful, I do have to divorce myself from that. So what are those implications for some of the programs that we're seeing at these other levels? And then two, graduate students are sort of playing this unique role where they might be teaching undergraduate students, right? Or they might be advising or mentoring in these research labs. And so what messaging is that potentially sending to those students? Like how are those students perhaps being socialized by the graduate students maybe in your study that feel that they have to divorce themselves from this their gender identities in order to be successful. So I think there are lots of implications that still point to this structural issue of, hey, like broader societal things need to change. Here are some concrete examples of the impacts in math education, and sort of like the university level math education enterprise.
That is so helpful. Thank you.
I'm specifically thinking too, I appreciated those points as well, Kristen. The comment on how it influences graduate teaching assistant socialization with intern impacts undergrads. There's a lot more literature there in math ed. So again, speaking of implications in the so what, we've got a lot more to potentially connect into there. Whereas if we're looking in other spaces that are more niche, so that feels like a practical thing that isn't too hard with the room space at least. Another thought I had, sorry, and another thought I had is some of the counter story research that has been going on. I know there was a recent talk that some of us were at because it's a grant based study that's happening. If you haven't, do you know what I'm talking about? Are you at least aware of it? Okay, I can send you the information.
I know what counterstory are, but
yeah,
I don't know specifically what talk you're talking about.
Does anybody know about the grant I'm talking about? I don't have the name off the top of my head, but it has been going for a while and they're connected to the AMS. They've been doing various talks or they're starting to disseminate the work. Anybody? Johan, you were there too. Do you happen to remember the name of the grant?
Wait, what?
The counter story.
Oh, yes. I don't remember the name of the grant. I can pull it up probably.
Yeah, I just it's a good thing to shout out because there aren't a ton of grants that are more in that math ed space explicitly. What? Anyway, they use a counterstorying methodology and they've been designing like very careful counter stories with, and I'm not saying that you would go this far in your work right now at least, but they've created like booklets that people can work through to think about the stories that they were hearing from I believe Black graduate students was their population of interest, but they developed these counter stories and created conversation around those. And it makes me think about, even though you haven't done the counter storytelling piece, like just having these stories openly available, having these detailed examples of how students are sharing how they think about themselves as women in math or what this means. I think that itself is a contribution because there hasn't been as much detail on that end. I wonder if it's more like how we write about what counts as a contribution in research sometimes. I know I'm not always the best about that because I'm thinking, woo, this is great. Everybody's going to be convinced when I'm writing it. And then I realize everybody's not convinced. Maybe I need to add a few lines. So I wonder if that might also be something, is positioning these more in-depth stories that haven't been amplified as much in the research space might be another way, in addition to some of the other things that Kristen pointed out in this work, at least.
Yeah, definitely. I guess thank you. I guess definitely also, for a preliminary report, I kind of just also take it with a grain of salt. Like I only have 5 pages, and so I can't tell you so what in addition to the results. But yeah, no, I think as researchers too, that you make a really good point that we need to sort of think about what is, I guess, valuable. I'm thinking like part of my research goals was to know these women's stories and acknowledge them as like agentic characters in their context who are also shaping the culture where they are. So I think like just the stories exist, like you're saying, Brady, like the stories existing themselves is like also important.
I'm just gonna shout out this grant. it is called Studying Successful Doctoral Students in Mathematics from Underrepresented Groups. And like I said, be on the lookout for some talks that they're going to be giving, because I really I don't know about the others who were there. I really enjoyed the conversation and some of the counter storytelling that they developed. They did in-depth interviews with 90 or 75 successful doc students of color, and their work seems like a really powerful piece that all of us should be aware of in this space, but also perhaps we can learn how to share this work in ways that are different from other approaches to sharing research.
Can you tell me what the grant was one more time?
Yeah, I really wish that I was on my. How about I can send out an email to everybody with some of the information.
Okay, that would be awesome. Thank you.
I want to give everybody credit, but I'm on my iPad, so I can't easily just type it up.
Okay, I was also trying to get Kristen's email address down really quick, so it's a little distraction. Yeah. Okay, well. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, yes. I did see a talk recently. I wasn't able to attend. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Okay. Yes, I remember that. Thank you. Any other questions? Goodbye. Thank you.
Okay, guys. I have to wrap it up. I have a class at 12. So thank you so much again. I'm gonna stop the recording.